Well, if you have a Bible with you this morning or a Bible app on your mobile device, I want to invite you and encourage you to open it to the book of Genesis, chapter 1. We're starting right at the beginning. I told you last week that last week we started a brand new series. The series is called In the Beginning, and for the next several months, we will be systematically making our way through the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Looking forward to what we will learn as we do that. Last week we began by looking just at the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then we did a brief overview of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Today we're going to concentrate our attention on verses 1 to 25 of Genesis chapter 1, and I'm going to begin today simply by reading it for you. This is God's Word, and this is what it says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together He called seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth," and it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. Verse 20, and God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Well, I have to tell you that coming to a passage like this one as a preacher is a daunting task. Partly because there is just so much in here that we will not cover and are not able to cover, and partly because many people, as they come to the book of Genesis, come with a lot of questions. I teach a class every fall, a college-level class on the Pentateuch, where we are able to sort of interact with all the different questions that people come with. We're able to linger over the creation accounts for some time. We don't have that luxury in order to do that, so there will be some things that get missed out as we do this. And part of me, as I think about this, the task of preaching is a little bit different than just being able to dialogue and interact around all of the questions that you might have. But I do want to say that at least in the early chapters of Genesis, you will get a combination or a mixture of teaching and preaching. And the task of preaching is a little bit different than the task of teaching. But I want to begin this morning by giving you some teaching that's related to this. I want to begin by making 4 general observations, 4 things related to how we should approach this chapter, especially as it relates to the question of human origins. I've adapted these 4 points from Gary Breshears' book on Christian doctrine, but the basics, or the basic outline of this, appears in a number of good theological books that deal with these types of questions. So the first general observation I want to make is simply this, that there is no conflict between Christianity and science. And that's an important first thing to remember as we come to this chapter, because there are certainly some members of the scientific community who are hostile towards the Christian faith. Here are the comments of physicist Steven Weinberg. He said, "I'm all in favor of a dialogue between science and religion, but not a constructive dialogue. One of the great achievements of science has been, if not to make it impossible for an intelligent person to be religious, then at least to make it possible for them not to be religious. We should not retreat from this accomplishment." So his viewpoint is basically there is no overlap between science and faith, and once you actually ground yourself in science, you won't have any room for faith yourself. And we do run into that type of thinking at times. Science deals in the realm of facts, and religion deals in the realm of myth and fable. Sometimes this debate gets framed as if it is white-coated scientists against black-robed preachers. All the intelligent people are on this side of the debate, and all the anti-intellectual types are on this side. But that is really a shallow caricature. There are, in fact, many eminent scientists who espouse faith in Christ. Physicist John Paulinghorn put it this way: "Science and religion are friends, not foes, in the common quest for knowledge." Some people may find this surprising, for there's a feeling throughout society that religious belief is outmoded or downright impossible in a scientific age. I don't agree. In fact, I'd go as far to say that if people in this so-called scientific age knew a bit more about science than many of them actually do, they'd find it easier to share my viewpoint. So what I want to say at the outset is that what we read in Genesis chapter 1 is not at odds with science. And we could actually go further than that. Now, Alan Sandage is a name that you may not know, but up until the time of his death in 2010, he was widely known in the scientific community. He was at one time a protege to the legendary astronomer Edwin Hubble. He received numerous prestigious honors from astronomical societies, including astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize. The New York Times dubbed Alan Sandage as the grand old man of cosmology. Sandage grew up in a Jewish home, but he was a virtual atheist even as a young child. At the age of 50, however, Alan Sandage became a Christian. And here's how he described his conversion to a reporter from Newsweek. He said, "It was science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science." He went on to say, "It was only through the supernatural that I came to understand the mystery of existence." This is very similar to what Stephen Meyer, an eminent geophysicist and also a Christian, said as he encountered specialists at the highest level of achievement who also identified themselves as Christians. He said his initial surprise was that they identified themselves as Christians not in spite of scientific evidence, but because of it. So the first thing to note is just to say that Christianity and science are not in conflict. Second thing to note is that there is total conflict between Christianity and scientific naturalism. Scientific naturalism is the worldview that all phenomena can be explained in terms of presently operating natural causes and laws. Scientific naturalism is a materialistic worldview, that the only thing you can trust is what you can see in observable experiments. God doesn't fit into that category, so he must not exist. Yuri Gagarin was a Russian cosmonaut. He was actually the first man in space, and when he came back from his 1968 mission, he is reported to have said, "I looked and looked, but I didn't see God." That's actually a disputed quote. He was a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, but this is the type of thinking that we run into, and this is the type of thinking that goes along with scientific naturalism. If we can't see it under a microscope or view it with a telescope, if we can't see God, then he must not exist. He's ruled out of the picture. And I said that there is a total conflict between Christianity and scientific naturalism. I'll explain a couple of the reasons why I say that in a few minutes. But first, I just want to point out that scientific naturalism is a view that is in conflict with itself. You can't actually hold to this view and be consistent that non-observable events are discounted. If you hold to the theory of evolution, you have to make some pretty large theoretical leaps. No matter how far back you push the timeline, you have to account for the fact that the universe had a beginning. Alan Guth is a proponent of naturalistic evolution. He wrote a book entitled The Inflationary Universe. And in that book, he proposes that the very highly condensed material that ultimately exploded at the Big Bang emerged out of nothing. And if you say to him that the physics doesn't work, he will say, yes, but at the Big Bang there was what physicists call a singularity. A singularity is an occurrence in which the normal laws of physics no longer operate. That means we no longer have access to them. Well, that seems convenient. Look, at that point, that is no longer science. That is just speculation, and it is wild speculation. One critic of Guth's theory, a mathematician by the name of David Berlinski, said this: "A lot of stuff that gets into print is simply nonsensical. Alan Guth's derivation of something from nothing is simply incandescent horse manure." Now, he uses stronger language than that, but he goes on to say, don't tell me that you're deriving something from nothing when it's transparently obvious to any mathematician that this is incandescent nonsense. Look, you cannot derive something out of nothing. So scientific naturalism is inconsistent with itself. But even more importantly, I want to say that it is incompatible with the view of creation that we find in the book of Genesis. There are a number of biblical reasons why we ought to reject the theory of evolution, but I want to highlight two of the ones that we see in the creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2. Firstly, we should notice the repetition of the phrase, according to their kinds. So we see it in verses 11 and 12, where it says, "And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." We see it again in verse 21. "So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the water swarms, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind." And again in verses 24 and 25, "And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind." This phrase indicates that there are divinely imposed limitations on what can result from reproduction. Theologian John Frame makes this helpful comment. He said, "I do not know how broadly these kinds should be construed or how they relate to modern biological classifications like family, genus, and species. But whatever a kind is, these passages evidently imply that plants and animals of one kind do not produce plants or animals of another. But that is what must happen if the theory of evolution must be true." Now look, those examples, or this idea does not rule out examples of what we might call microevolution or variations within a species. So we all know of examples of this. So one example could be that in some environments, moths of a certain color become more preponderant, and in a different environment, moths of a different color will become the dominant ones in that region because color proves to be an aid in survival or in reproduction. But that kind of evolution is a far cry from the alleged process that creates new species or the theory that everything simply evolved from a single cell. Second biblical reason to reject scientific naturalism from Genesis has to do with the Bible's description of the creation of man. Now, next week we'll be looking at the creation of man in God's image. We read about it later in Genesis chapter 1. And when we come to chapter 2, we will see a zoomed-in picture of man's creation that is described as a special act. Genesis 2 verse 7 says, "Then the Lord God formed the man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." So man did not evolve from any other existing creature. God made him from dust and breathed life into him. And that picture is incompatible with scientific naturalism and the theory of evolution. Third observation about how we should approach this chapter is that the Bible in general, and the book of Genesis in particular, was not written with the intention of being a scientific textbook. Now, one of the most basic questions we can ask and should ask with any type of literature that we read is, what is the genre of this? What type of writing am I reading here? Because you apply different principles when you're reading a technical instruction manual than you do when you're reading one of Shakespeare's sonnets. The Bible contains many different genres. You find history and poetry and prophecy and parable and apocalyptic literature, and you apply different interpretive principles to each of those genres. So the natural question is, what genre is Genesis 1? What type of literature is this? Is this history? Is this poetry? The answer is yes. Genesis 1 is actually a mixed genre. There's no doubt that it gives us and aims to give us some historical particulars about creation and what took place. But there are also clear evidences of a poetic structure to this chapter, and there are demonstrable examples of symbolism in it. What is clear is that this was not written as a science textbook. It was not written to answer all of the specific questions we might have. In Galileo's famous words, the Holy Ghost intended to teach us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Kent Hughes, the longtime pastor of College Church in Wheaton, Illinois, summarizes the genre of Genesis 1 well when he says this: Genesis 1 is therefore exalted, carefully structured and worded narrative prose, history. Certainly, it is not meant to be an exhaustive account of creation. It is only 1 page long. It must not be treated as a photograph of creation, but rather as a broad-stroked painting of what happened when God created the heavens and the earth. I think that's a helpful way to look at it. Fourth general observation about this chapter is that one's view of the date of creation should not be the litmus test for Christian faithfulness. Now, I say this because there are good Bible-believing Christians and scholars who reach different conclusions about these types of things. See, we tend to come to a passage like this and we bring all of our modern Western questions. We read a passage like this and we want to know when, and we want to know how specifically. But I have to say that after studying this passage for many years, I'm convinced that the questions it is answering is not so much the questions of how and when, but the questions of who and why. Who created and why did he create? About 30 years ago, a Christian thinker by the name of Francis Schaeffer wrote a little book called Genesis in Space and Time, The Flow of Biblical History. And in that book, he argues that one of the ways to minimize some of the endless debates that cloud discussions of origin is by asking this question: what is the least that Genesis 1 and the following chapters must be saying for the rest of the Bible to make sense? Well, we're actually going to cover these chapters in much the same fashion. I'm not going to tell you everything that I think Genesis 1 and 2 might be saying, but what is the irreducible minimum that these chapters must be saying for the Bible to have any coherence going forward? And I say this because, look, there are differences of opinion about whether the earth is young or old, and whether the days that are described here are literal 24-hour days or something different altogether. Some people read verse 1 as a summary to the entire chapter. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the rest of it is sort of the how this took place. Others read verses 1 and 2 as sort of part of this original creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And they would say, well, maybe the earth existed in that state for an indeterminate number of years, and then verse 3 picks up with a subsequent creation, and God said, let there be light, and brings this about. Well, I don't want our Sunday mornings to be taken up with all of the technical discussions around those things. My own view when it comes to the 6 days of creation is that it seems most natural to me to take them as literal 24-hour days. But it's not heretical to believe otherwise. When it comes to the age of the earth, I'm actually undecided on the question. It's entirely possible that the earth is young and that God simply created everything with the appearance of maturity, much the way that Adam and Eve would have appeared as adults. But it's also possible that the earth is actually much older, that humanity is young and the earth is older than that. The point is that none of those things are the litmus test of Christian orthodoxy. Well, I almost feel like we need a stretch break at this point, right? So we are going to shift gears a little bit now, because I want to highlight a couple of the things that I think we are supposed to learn from this chapter, or two of the things we're supposed to learn, and one way that we are supposed to respond. What I want to do is I want to highlight two truths about God that are revealed in Genesis chapter 1, and I think it's fitting that we start here because this chapter is saturated with God. God is the subject of the very first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God is mentioned no less than 35 times in this chapter. God is the author, the main character, and the lead actor. This is his story. First thing we learn about God is that God is separate and distinct from his creation. And this is an important truth for us to understand about God. It was an important truth in the day that it was given. There were all sorts of creation stories in the ancient world, but none like this one. There were all sorts of stories about various gods creating various parts of the world. So you had a God of light battling with the God of darkness. You had a God who created the lands and sort of subdued the chaos of the seas. But there is nothing like this account of the one majestic God who stands over and above all of creation and rules it all. God is transcendent. He's separate from what he's created. He stands above it. Now, when we talk about God's separateness from creation, we're talking about the ways that he is distinct from it. A technical, sort of theological way of referring to this is to speak about God's incommunicable attributes. So theologians refer to God's communicable attributes. Those are the attributes that he shares with us, the things we can share in common with him. And his incommunicable attributes, those are the things that are his and his alone. And I want to highlight three of them that we see here. Firstly, we see that God is eternal. The opening verse of Genesis takes us to the very beginning. In the beginning, God. Now, if you're familiar with the book of Genesis, then you will know that the book of Genesis is filled with genealogies. So all through it, you find these little accounts that will say something like, these are the generations of so-and-so. And so lived X number of years, and then he became the father of so-and-so. And then so-and-so lived X number of years, and he became the father of such and such. But there is no genealogy for God, because God has no beginning. He simply is. And there never was a time that God did not exist. He was there in the beginning. Psalm 90 is a psalm that was written by Moses, and it puts it this way: before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This is the biblical view of the origin of the universe. God is the only necessary being. There was never a time when there was absolutely nothing. If there were, then there would be nothing now, because something doesn't come from nothing. Francis Collins is the former head of the National Genome Project. It was a 13-year-long project to classify DNA. He was the leading expert on DNA. And he said this: I can't imagine how nature, in this case the universe, could have created itself. And the very fact that the universe had a beginning implies that someone was able to begin it, and it seems to be that had to be outside of nature. As Christians, we say that someone is the eternal God. Second attribute of God that we see here is that he is sovereign. Verse 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the rest of the chapter tells us that he spoke things into being. And the picture that emerges from this chapter is that of a sovereign, a ruler, a king, who issues decrees and commands, and everything that he says comes to pass immediately. Again, in the ancient world, there were all sorts of fears. Fears about darkness, fears about waters, fears about the sun and the moon and the stars. The message of Genesis 1 to those living at the time was that there was no need to fear any of those things, because God is sovereign over all of them. And nothing that exists, or that there is nothing that exists that is not under his control and his sovereign rule. And that same word should be a comfort to us in our day. God is not taken by surprise by anything that happens in our lives or in our world. He's sovereign over every aspect of his creation. Thirdly, he's self-sufficient. The point here is that God is complete in himself. He did not create us because he was bored or because he was lonely. God is separate from his creation. He doesn't need anything from us. When the Apostle Paul preached in the city of Athens, he said this: the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. So God doesn't need worshipers or helpers or defenders. He is self-sufficient in a way that none of us are or ever will be. Now, it's only hinted at in this chapter, but you can actually see the doctrine of the Trinity in this passage, or begin to get a glimpse of it. In verse 2, it says, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then a little bit later in verse 26, it says, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. The question is, who is the us? Who does the our refer to? Well, it certainly can't refer to the angels, because nowhere in the Bible do we read that man was created in the image of the angels. It's possible it could be a plural of majesty, sort of like the royal we, and when God speaks, he speaks with that kind of air. But the most likely explanation of this is that this is a plural of deliberation. God is deliberating. The members of the Godhead are deliberating among themselves. Again, it's just a glimpse of the Trinity, that God eternally exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And within the Trinity, there is a perfect relationship. See, part of what it means for us to be created in God's image is that we are relational creatures. But unlike God, we need someone outside of ourselves to relate to. God has no such need. He's self-sufficient. So the first truth we learn about God is that he's separate and distinct from his creation. The second thing we learn is that God reveals himself to his creation. So if the first truth is about God's separateness, this point is about God's nearness. God reveals himself to us. He makes himself known. He wants us to know him. And this passage demonstrates at least three ways that God reveals himself. The first way is through creation itself. Now, when we look at this account and we look at the world around us, we actually learn something about God. We learn that God is a God of great power. He speaks and things come into being. We also learn that he's a God of order. There's a beautiful symmetry to this account when you read it. There's corresponding days. On day 1, God creates the light. And on day 4, he creates the light bearers, the sun and the moon and the stars. Then on day 2, God creates the waters and the sky. And on day 5, its corresponding day, he creates the inhabitants of the waters and the sky, the fish and the birds. On day 3, God creates the vegetation, or creates land and the vegetation that grows upon it. And then on day 6, he creates the inhabitants of the land, all the creatures and mankind. Verse 2 says that the earth was formless and void. And so the first 3 days of creation solved the formless problem. And then the next 3 days solved the problem of the void. They fill the earth. There's an order to this account, and it reflects God's nature as a God of order. And of course, when you just look at the universe, you can see there's an order to it. When you look at the complexity of an eyeball, for instance, you can see there's a design to this. And design points to a designer. Order does not spring from chaos. We also learn that God is a God of beauty and goodness. Over and over as God creates. At the end of each day it says, and God saw that it was good. He pronounces it good. And at the very end he says, and it was very good. Creation reflects God's goodness. And there is evidence of this. Every time you take a bite out of a strawberry, every time you see the color green, or every time you just stop to admire a sunset, you can see the goodness of God in what he has made. I remember being struck by this when I was on the Ash River near Port Alberni with a friend of mine. We had brought our families and taken them for a hike, and he knew the area well, and we had kind of trudged in through some backcountry, and he had brought a couple of masks and snorkels along, and we jumped into the icy water, and I still remember just sort of the beauty that I saw when I put my face under the water, and these rainbow trout just came swimming underneath me. And I remember coming out of the water, and the verse that just jumped into my mind was from Isaiah 6. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is filled with his glory. That's the world we live in. Everywhere we turn and we see the beauty, it is filled with the glory of God. It reveals who he is. The psalmist put it this way. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world. Travel wherever you will, and you will see the glory of God if you look for it. And that psalm teaches us that we learn something about God simply by looking at the world that he has made, that we find ourselves in. And it's true that we can learn some things about God just by observing nature. But human observation and human reason alone will not necessarily help us reach the right conclusion. We need the written revelation of God in order to fully understand. A number of years ago, when I was doing college ministry, we were talking about creation and what creation reveals about God. And as a way to sort of have an object lesson around that, I remember coming in one night to speak, and I brought with me a bookcase that I had made. And I placed it on the stage and simply asked those who were there, even if you didn't know me and you looked at this bookcase, what could you know about me? And it was a bright group of students, so they actually did pretty well with this. I mean, someone said, well, the very first thing would be that you must love books. I mean, why else would you build a bookcase? It's a good observation. Someone else, took a closer look at it and said, well, I mean, it's made out of oak and not a cheaper material, so maybe you could, postulate that you like sort of finer things. Someone else took a closer look at it, and there were some obvious defects in the craftsmanship. And they could tell, this guy's not really a carpenter. One guy said, well, I mean, I would probably know that you were short just based on the height of the bookcase, right? You just look at what I made and you could say, these are fair observations to make about this person. But there are some things that you would not have known about me. I mean, you wouldn't have known anything about my family. You wouldn't have known what types of books I like, what my interests are, what my passions are. In order to do that, you would have to talk to me. And in the same way, I would say that God's revelation is there for all to see. We can observe, we can gauge a lot of things based on the created world that we find ourselves in. But his revelation is not limited to what we can see in the world that he has made. God reveals himself through his spoken word. Now, I mean something very specific by that. What I mean is that he reveals himself as a speaking God right here in the very first chapter. 10 times in this chapter, we read the words, "and God said." Now, we could understand this as just sort of a metaphorical way of saying that God brought everything into existence by his power. But what is most striking is that once he creates Adam and Eve, he actually speaks to them. This is how he reveals himself. Don Carson comments on this by saying, the God of the Bible in the very first chapter is not some unmoved mover, some spirit impossible to define, some ground of all beings or mystical experience. He has personality and dares to disclose himself in words that human beings understand. See, God is a speaking God. And the fact that God is a speaking God, a God who reveals himself through words, is seen for the first time here in Genesis chapter 1. But this is actually what we see throughout the entire Bible. Earlier, I read you a couple of verses from Psalm 19, the psalm that begins, "The heavens declare the glory of God." The first half of that psalm focuses on creation and what we learn about God from it. But the second half of that psalm goes on to talk about God's special revelation through the Bible. It says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes." So how do you gain full enlightenment of your eyes toward God and know what he's like? It's through his word. So God reveals himself through creation, through his word, and ultimately, God reveals himself through his Son. I've already said this is just hinted at in this chapter when God says, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." If that's all we had to go on, we might not know what to make of it, but the New Testament sheds light on that verse. The Gospel of John begins in this way: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Or we could turn to Colossians chapter 1, where it says this of Jesus: "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Or we could look at Hebrews chapter 1. "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power." So God has revealed himself in creation. He's revealed himself in his word, and ultimately he's revealed himself in his Son. So if you're waiting for God to reveal himself to you, I would encourage you to look again at Jesus, because God has made himself fully known in Jesus. So how do we respond to all of this? How do we respond to Genesis chapter 1? What are we supposed to do after we read it? Well, I think the only appropriate response to this is the response of worship. The psalmist, reflecting on creation, said this: "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" That's really a staggering thought, isn't it? When you take a look at all the stars in the heavens, you see all the beauty that God has made. To know that God takes an interest in your life, cares for what's happening there. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6 says, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them, and you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you." That's the way we respond to our Creator, is that we fall on our knees before Him, and we say, "I can't believe that the one who put all of this into place cares about me and loves me," and He does. And He demonstrated that through the sending of His Son to redeem us. So let's worship Him. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for your character, for who you are, that from eternity past you have existed and had this plan. God, we marvel at some of the things we see in creation. Many of them are still a mystery to us. We do not know how they work. We may never know. But you have revealed yourself to us in that. You have revealed yourself to us in your word, and you have revealed yourself to us in Jesus. And God, we pray that we would not miss it, that we would see you for who you are, and that we would respond the right way. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.